do, but I think hamburger helpers just otherwise nothing. Yeah, we started recording.
Just did. Good evening. I like to call to order the March 25th, 2025 work session. Move on to item 3, budget and finance. Item 3.01, capital area intermediate unit operating budget 2025, 2026.
So, all right. So the IU operating budgets here, I know Mr. Bradley kind of touched on this under his report in the previous meeting or previous meetings as the case may be. I would just draw your attention. There's good reading in all 21 pages, from our colleagues at the IU, but in short, I would go to the very last page, page 21, and look at the district contribution. I would point out the 2 blue boxes there, or 2 columns, I should say. And you can see that there's no increase or decrease for any of the school districts. And so in terms of what that operating contribution looks like will remain the same. And then our operating contribution, you can see it's pretty small print there, but it's about $46,000 when you look in the first of the 2 blue columns, column 7. So status quo, if you will, and as part of the process, all the districts, once the IU board has voted and looked at the budget rather, then the school districts will all vote and the budgets are due back by mid to end April. And so we're on a good trajectory. We'll look at this with the board and then present it at the April 8th board.
And just as a reminder, this is the only budget that the school districts vote on. There are many other budgets that the IU has, but a lot of those are tied into grants. And so it's money that they have to reconcile with the grants that they're receiving or money that they're getting from the state for one or more different services. This is the only one that we actually vote on. But this is, of course, the largest one, I should say one of the largest percentages. So
Can you explain why there's no increase at all? Like, how do you get away with no increase?
they just continue to control where the money is coming from. You know, they see some additional funding coming from the states. They are also kind of expanding some of their services to get some revenue from some other areas that had not been a revenue stream for them before. So they're just continue to look at ways to keep it under control, keep it low, and minimize the impact. So there are some other revenue streams that they're also getting as well.
Do you know how many years? I mean, that's been since, how many years have you been on the board?
This board or that board?
That board.
This is my second dance with them. So it's probably been about 5-6 years now.
Because I was on before that and it hadn't been increased. Do you know how many years?
It's been a while since they've increased.
Great.
Yes.
What other services they provide, those costs?
Well, so this is your operating budget, but what may come back is it may have been that they were charging us $1 for something. Now it's $1.05 for something. So it's kind of offsetting in that aspect of it as well. So yes, it looks like our contribution is, but there are also,
But when we actually use additional services, we
Correct.
may be paying more
correct,
for inflation.
correct.
For example, there's IU classrooms that we have slots in that will have a student go to for particular needs, and the cost of those slots is changed.
Correct. So again, in a roundabout way, like anything else. Can't say across the board, everything that we're being charged from the IU is staying the same, but at least from a overall general operating budget, they've been able to keep that and offset it with programs.
That in essence, our dues, our contribution to keep the entity going have remained constant.
Correct.
But they also, and you pointed this out, I mean, they also have revenue generating, like I know their services they were providing for schools in Wisconsin, like they're constantly growing some of their revenue streams as well that kind of help with that.
Well, that they were doing that actually as almost a for-profit
Yeah,
or
right,
at profit.
right.
I will say ultimately, the IU does continue to evolve their services. There's some things that we choose not to be a part of, but there's plenty of things that we have chosen to be a part of. The evolution of things that they offer has been a benefit to us specifically. And you've talked about, Mr. Bradley, on a few of your reports, some of the things that they're doing with cybersecurity and some of the initiatives they're doing there to be able to bring the buying power, if you will, across school districts have really been beneficial to us and several things that we're including in our budget to be able to buy into.
And I think this will be moved forward to the April meeting. Yes, additional discussion and vote. Item 3.02, general fund budget expense 2025, 2026. Mr. Longwell.
So Dr. Betts and I are going to work on this as a team on the presentation. I'll probably lead off here and then at some point turn it over to the good doctor. In terms of general fund budget, just as a reminder, we do our presentations in two parts. And so earlier this month, we reviewed the revenue side of the budget, knowing that we were still kind of finalizing the entirety of the budget and that we were going to come back at this meeting and present not only the expense side of the budget, but also kind of the entire, here's the final proposal for the school board's consideration. Ultimately, and just by way of thinking about the timeline of what's to come, following tonight's presentation, the board then will have the opportunity to kind of consider not only both presentations, but you have your budget binders in front of you. So there's additional supporting documentation in there that you can look at. We would then be asking the board to approve the first of two approvals at the April board meeting. Then the budget goes out for public consideration. It's an opportunity for the public to view it. And then we come back in June to the second approval where we would final adopt and then get everything set for the following school year. So just a quick preview of the process and reminder about timeline. In terms of the expense presentation, we often like to kind of look at, well, what makes up our budget? And we kind of look at these different areas. You can see personnel is about 68%. As the board knows, this probably fluctuates a little bit. There's been years where it's been 69 or 70%, but generally it's in that general vicinity. And in terms of personnel, that includes salaries, benefits, everything connected to the staff that we employ here at the school district. The next biggest area is 17% contracted services, instruction and support. I think this one I would say is a variety of things rolled up into this one category. It includes everything from transportation to contracted placements for student services and special ed. I would also point out probably a lot of mandated costs in here in this 17%. Charter schools are in there. Like I said, a lot of mandated costs. So when you look at debt service, that's the next largest category at 9%. We'd like for us to be at 10% or below. That's kind of a good threshold to look at. When you look at a state level, on average, school districts probably have a 6 or 7.5% debt service. We're probably a little bit above average, but that's also, I would suggest, because we just wrapped up a 9-year, 10-year financing plan and construction plan. And so you would expect that our debt service might be a little higher than average, as everyone is at a different point in their facility conversation. And so as we're wrapping it up, there might be other districts that are just starting it, or they might be in the middle of it, or wherever they're at in their own processes. Supplies and equipment is at 6%. And again, a variety of things in supplies and equipment here, everything from the supplies for our classrooms, but our equipment replacement cycles that we use in facilities or other departments. And so again, just a very quick high level snapshot of what comprises our budget and what are some categories contained therein. Some things we want to talk about a little bit with the board this evening is what are some trends that we're seeing? And so if the board recalls back in the fall, we had done kind of a little bit of a preview of where we were with the budget, not so much looking at the 25-26 budget, but it was an opportunity to say, what were some trends that we were seeing from the 23-24 school year that we just ended, and now that we're operating in 24-25. I always like to look at it as we're looking at 3 years, and so I always try to keep that straight in my mind. And Dr. Betts and I's conversations with Mrs. Ely and the team, but we're really going back and saying 23-24 was the last complete year, so the trends there are important. But then we monitor trends through the 24-25 school year, where we're now in March, not quite completed the year, but those trends help inform ultimately maybe where we're heading. And then we're coming back to talk to the board about what does that mean for 25-26. And so within that, some things we wanted to point out were construction, really connected to the financing plan, looking at some recurring costs, things like what's increasing around salary and benefits, things of that nature, and then ultimately enrollment and program. And so as the presentation goes, we'll talk about those three areas. And then look a little closer at what are some of the things influencing the budget for the upcoming year. Just as a reminder, we're continuing to step in that 1% connected with a financing plan. And so that's the equivalent of the 1% tax increase. And so you would see that on the revenue side of the equation, but then you likewise would see that equal amount on the expense side of the equation in terms of financing. It's good to kind of take a little bit of a walk down memory lane maybe and think about just how far we've come and the journey we've been on. So if we go back to the feasibility study in 2015, that led to the recommendations from the feasibility study committee then in around 2016, I would say. And then ultimately in 2017 and 18, we began conversations about the priority of which projects, what was the proposed scope, how are we going to pay for it? And ultimately, a big part of that was our financing plan. We talked about with Ford over the years about that, but it would require stepping in additional millage over a period of time to support some ongoing borrowings that we were doing to ultimately pay for construction. And so beginning with 18-19, we started with 1%, and then you can kind of see the progression of things out to 26-27. The asterisk there for 26-27, I know we're talking about 25-26, is that we have one more year left as part of our financing plan. So we always like to remind in our discussions about budget about what's the totality of that plan. And so after 25-26, one more year of phasing in millage to support the costs associated with that. Recurring costs, salary increases. So this includes everything from the contracted salary increases to where are we at with, rolling forward support staff salaries, things of that nature. That's generally around that $1.2 million range. Personnel costs with benefits is about $2.7 million. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the coming slides, but health insurance, medical insurance has been a really large driving factor. And I think frankly is part of, as we narrate the story around 25-26 budget and what were some of the biggest influencing factors, medical insurance is definitely one of the very big ones that we'll talk about. The second large one is we're listed right below it with commercial charter schools. You can see that $700,000 increase is a significant one. And we have a slide that will talk a little more about what's going on with the charter school costs. As a final item, utilities. I think just like in my personal life, I see my electric bill rising and other utilities, water and sewer rising, and we're not immune to that. And so we have additional costs associated with the utilities that we're seeing, again, based on the trends that we monitored through 23, 24, 24, 25, and then some expectation of what we will be seeing in 25, 26.
I think in addition to obviously just utility prices going up, we also have more square footage period. For heating of larger buildings, have additional electricity. So yeah, so there's the prices and the space.
Thank you. I'd be remiss if I didn't. It's the both of those. That's a good call out.
Is it worth, or have we examined the solar programs that are available to PA schools specifically?
Yeah, we've had some conversations. I think one of the challenges with some of those solar conversations is there's a lot of assumptions baked into if you ever see their big spreadsheets that they have with the potential savings, and so much of it's influenced on, well, what's the assumed purchase price of electricity over 20 or 30 years? What's the assumed rebates, the tax credits that are out there? They used to be just available to the private sector or the business, the for-profit businesses. Now there's been some law changes about that I think are worth continuing to look at. Suffice it to say, we haven't shut the door on solar. I think it's worth continuing to look at, but I also think the devil's in the details a little bit with some of those projections. I've had conversations where I've talked to a vendor about it, pointed out some questions about the assumptions, and then I see a new version come with a different number, and that just makes me wonder a little bit. So again, not that we're against it, but I think just continue to look at that with a critical eye and maybe getting feedback from even smaller neighbors about those that already have solar and what's their feedback on how it's going.
As long as that conversation, just as it would with any cost center that we're, that sounds like a good idea.
So we talked about a couple areas couple factors, I should say, that are particularly impacting our expense side of the budget. Medical expense is one of them. So over the years, we've talked with the board about what happens not only year over year, but cumulatively when you look back at a trend of, say, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. It's interesting when we look at those trends, generally, I'll say before the last couple of years, our trends have been almost 8% in all of those different trending, years. So if you look to the 3, 5, 7, 10 year, it was almost always 8%. The individual bars, you can see there's some that either maybe outpace that a little bit or maybe are a little bit under. But if you draw a line of best fit, you can see generally the trend was pretty consistent until you get to 23, 24. You can see a pretty sharp increase there. And then we've seen that sharp increase carry into 24, 25. And frankly, this is where oftentimes we've in prior years looked at, we'll continue to budget that 8% because in any given year, it might be a little over, a little under, but we'll catch it just by continuing to budget 8%. We're at the point now where, because of where medical insurance spend was for 23, 24 and where it's going to be heading for 24, 25, we've got to catch the budget up. And so it's going to require an adjustment of around $2.3 million in the general fund budget to get us back to kind of reset the budget and get back on track with where we think we'll be heading. An additional piece of context there, maybe that I think would be important is for 23, 24, you can see we're just shy of 11 million. As we've looked at those trends with Mrs. Ely and Dr. Bitts, I would expect 24, 25 probably to be somewhere a shade under 12 million. And then you project that forward again for 25, 26. And that's where you start to see that large adjustment. The good news is, I think as we project forward for 25, 26, as we've looked at the kind of the weekly claims, if you will, and the monthly claims, all of those trending data points. In the spring, we've seen the trend to maybe return more to normal. So I don't want to completely, scare us all, but acknowledging that 23, 24, 24, 25 definitely were more significant than usual in terms of the increases. And now we kind of have to right size the budget to catch it back up.
So you noted that we had been kind of budgeting an 8% increase.
Yeah.
Will are you just bumping up once and then go back to the 8%, or are you starting to?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I would say we've kind of looked at it several ways to kind of recalculate where we think medical insurance is heading. Because I think in 23, 24, 24, 25, you had some very unique situations, right? And so do you project off that base? Is that the new normal, or do you make some adjustments to say, let's take aside what some of those one-time things were happening, maybe remove a little bit of the noise from that projection, and then reset our expectations. And so we have, I would say, done that at this point. Our hope is that by resetting the budget for 25, 26, then maybe we'll see it settle back into that 8%. And because we caught the budget up, then we shouldn't be chasing, that expenditure number down, and maybe it's reset back.
Yeah, are those expenses coming from additional staff that you're bringing on, or do you think it's looking more like the insurance costs are going up?
Yeah, I would say it's probably provider costs going up, but it's also certainly utilization. And probably going back to the fall discussion with the board where we talked about high dollar claimants. And so Conrad Siegel is our healthcare consultant. And so we work alongside of them to say, what's happening with medical insurance expense. And certainly in the last, I'll say 23, 24 and 24, 25, we had a number of high dollar claimants that they were tracking. And those number of high dollar claimants are above $100,000 and $200,000, where in some years we might only have 2 or 3 of those individuals. But in 23, 24, 24, 25, we were seeing like 5, 6, and 7 probably.
Yeah, I would say the two things. One was the abnormal number of high dollar claimants, and then the second was the rise in prescription costs related particularly to HLP one.
Oh, GLP-1, yeah. I think there's one. Well, all the specialty drugs have a little different acronyms, so I think HLP, GLP, they're all, but
the weight loss drugs. The increase in prescriptions for those and the costs associated with those prescriptions have gone up significantly in the last 2 years.
That's a good call out, because I think that is, as much as there's the cost of services, in particular, the cost of specialty drugs, which I recognize is a derivative of the cost of services and things being provided, but specialty drugs is definitely a big conversation that we're having with our consultant, but also our colleagues at other school districts. So that's something we've got, I think, continue to monitor. So. PA cyber charter schools. So this is a trend line that you'd like to see flatten out a little bit, perhaps. I will say this though, when you look at the 3 lines, so the blue line there is our average special ed enrollment. The orange line is our non-special ed enrollment. I know that you certainly can see that we've added students, but I think the other piece that's maybe helpful context is that if you look at this as a percentage, you can see the very bottom left-hand corner calls that out. If you look at this as a percentage of our total enrollment, that helps to frame this conversation a little bit as well to say, generally, we're within 3 to 5% of our total enrollment being enrolled in cyber charter schools. It certainly impacts costs along the way. I think cost is also a factor of 2 things. Just like we were talking about with medical insurance, there's multiple variables impacting it. Cyber charter school, I think you can obviously point to the total enrollment that's out at the cyber charter schools, but back to the fair funding of schools too, because our own expenses ultimately inform what the tuition rates are to the cyber charter schools. Then as our expenses go up, so too does the tuition we pay per student, which is not necessarily directly linked to the cost of cyber charter schools providing those services to those students. It's really just based on a brick and mortar school district's own costs. And I think that's part of that conversation from the advocacy perspective.
So.
The 22, 23, 23, 24 non-special ed, that big jump there. Is that like at a high school to track like what level are we losing students that say K kindergarten and up, or are they going over at a certain age? Or
Yeah, it's kind of some random grade levels. We do track that and continue to monitor where there are increases, but it's not
so
necessarily.
there's not like a specific pattern of saying we're losing this group at this particular like grade level, age level.
Not that it's revealed itself to this point.
I think that's a good question. And when you really take a look at it, it's hard to pinpoint any one thing because the easy thing is to go back and say, well, let's look at all the students that are out of cyber charter schools. And over the years, we've taken deep dives on this at different points. And interestingly, in one of our analysis there, we found that there's a number of students that never even stepped foot in our buildings. They're just transferring to school districts because they moved and they were already out of cyber charter school and they move into our district. And so then they become our bill because they're part of the district of residence, but they never were in our buildings. And so it's a little challenging to reach those families because they probably are already kind of enrolled in the platform. They might be happy with it. And they never really got to experience what it was to be at Mechanicsburg. And so there's a whole host of those reasons, I would say, and it's difficult to say any one of them is the main contributing factor.
So you don't really have a number for the charter school, so around 200 kids,
Yeah, it's 230.
230. So we're paying $4.5 million for 230 kids.
It's about 15,000 for non-special ed and 30,000 for special ed. All of them is 600,000. And that could be a special ed speech and language student. That could be somebody who's regular ed with us and then become special ed once they've gone to cyber.
And that's some of what we've talked about as a group too. If you think about the delta, the difference between the regular ed and special ed. So if it's almost $15,000 times 67 kids, that's another $1 million of revenue the cyber charter schools are getting for those 67 kids. I think something I personally wrestle with a little bit is, are they spending that $1 million on those 67 kids? Or, and that's part of the conversation at state level is how do we fairly fund them? Because there's definitely been some conversation that it looks like that might not always be the case.
Definitely not the case.
Yeah.
But you're saying right now the funding is sort of based on what our costs are in our
Yes.
district. So if you have another district that has to pay twice as much per student.
To go to the same facility.
And receive the same education.
And that's been the fallacy of it since the cyber portion of it that lumped in with the original brick and mortar, which was much fairer at that 8% cost level.
I think Dr. Pitts did a good job of calling that out maybe earlier in the year, or could have been even fall probably. But the variance from high to low is pretty significant, to your point, Mr. Pickline. You could have it as low as, I think, like 8,000 or 7,800 is maybe the very low end for regular ed, but I think it goes all the way up to like 28,000. And all those 500 school districts are in between somewhere, right? You know, and so, but all 500 school districts use those different rates to pay the same cyber charter schools who are providing the same education. I think that's the crux of it, is not saying cyber charter schools should go away, but how can they be funded fairly, and funded fairly for regular ed students, but also special ed, because what level of need are those 67 students? Shouldn't it be based on whatever additional services are being provided versus say, here's a number based on all of our special ed students, which is kind of how that's derived.
I was on a call yesterday with the SBA's, one of their lobbyists and a group of school districts, and one of the districts was paying $5,000 for regular ed. So they were a little frustrated with what the lobbyists had said, was the current position is $8,000, and they're kind of happy if they get to 10 to 14 where they think they might land on that. And she's like, that's, you know, and so bad for some districts, but they were saying, she said, why would I be supportive of this? And he was saying, well, in the out years of this, even at 10 or more, that will bring that overall cost down for everybody over the next 5 to 10 years. But I think for us, for sure, you know, if it was at $10,000 for the 163 regular ed students, that takes that down to 1.6 million instead of whatever that component is of the total cost there. So I think that's good for us. Whatever they land at would be significantly better.
But this has been an ongoing battle for what, 25, 30 years, and nothing has changed. It's ridiculous.
We have to engage with the students like annually, right? The ones that are outside of the district. Or-
So really the main engagement with cyber charter schools is with attendance.
Okay,
So
what does that mean?
they still report back to us if a student is not.
But we don't have to engage. We don't engage at all with,
Academic wise.
or even just like, hi, we're your school district. Here's the charter's performance metrics, and here's our performance metrics.
So we continue to periodically remind families of the options that we have in the district. I think last year was the last time we sent the mailing out to our cyber families, the families residing within our district, to try and get some back. Ultimately, see a whole lot of success in that, but we continue to make those efforts, make some phone calls and try and have conversations to discuss it.
I feel like it's not a suggestion, but I'm just saying in general, like you have to, the sales tactic, right, is you gotta talk to people 7 times before they understand what you're talking about. And, or it sinks in or registers with them, and the idea of, oh yeah, I keep seeing one chart is down at the low end and one chart's at the, you know, at least steady. I'm not saying where achievement goes like upward slope, but it's pretty darn good in comparison to alternatives.
Those charter schools have millions and millions of dollars in advertising.
I understand.
So
Yeah.
you're gonna see a commercial way more than 7 times you want to talk to them.
Sure, no, I'm with, but if you're already in there, I would say those commercials kind of, you know, I don't know, they don't bounce off. I see plenty of people with CCA sweatshirts all over the place. It's very good brand awareness that they do. And I think, I'm not advocating that we could keep up with that, but I do think I don't want to throw in the towel either. I think we have good numbers that we show. We believe in this overall as a model, and for the effort of a 2-pager that goes out to them once a year, I don't feel like that's a huge lift or something. Again, not a specific thing I want to endorse, but I feel like regular engagement could help, right? To the tune of 15 to 30 grand of we got one back.
And there are times I do want to call out the efforts of Mrs. Woodall, but also Mrs. Bruce. Like, we have folks on staff that do try to engage in those conversations. And sometimes we do get families to come back. It's just tough on the whole, you know, and it doesn't mean that we stop trying. I think through the years, we have tried different things and we'll continue to try different things and study the data and see what it's telling us. But it's just one thing that I think for me, while we're still doing all of that, I think that advocacy piece is maybe also just as important to continue to try to press that things like shouldn't special ed tuition rate be based on the cost of actual services versus the cost of what we provide services to, which should be driven on need.
Dr. Bitts, you referenced attendance. It's the only time we really engage with those. If there's an issue of truancy, is that our responsibility then to pursue that?
So when they reported to us, which, yes,
So that's an expense that we have in addition to.
What about medical concerns? Do they handle that themselves? Or-
yeah.
We don't have, but once they go out to cyber church, we don't have a ton of, as Dr. Bitts alluded to, a ton of kind of interaction with the families. They have folks there, whether it's CCA or PA Cyber or whatever, that are kind of handling all of those different issues. And really, from our perspective, it comes down to we get a monthly invoice, well, maybe not always monthly, a periodic invoice, I'll say, and we pay it. The way the law is set up, though, frankly, some schools, like if you don't pay timely, or if you don't pay at all, they have the ability to go through PDE and have your subsidy deducted. We pay the invoices, they come in, we try to reconcile them, well, we do reconcile them. But frankly, it's again, it's kind of a system it's interesting when you take a deep dive into it and look at the process and look how it's funded and look at all these different aspects.
So like, if a child would go from one cyber school to another one, I mean, do they give you that notice like once a year?
Depends.
I mean, like they could be making money off of a child that's not there anymore for how long before we notice that child's not there anymore?
And
Until we get the quarter bill.
that residency piece is something that can and do try to look at, with our registrar. Because that's an issue and that has happened at a prior district. Certainly, when I first got there, we kind of audited the list, if you will, and found there was a family of 4 or 5 kids. Good for us, unfortunately for our neighbor, because there's in the neighboring district. But we do look at the kind of the rosters because their obligation is to send not only the bill, they've got to send all the backup to the show.
Yeah, I've seen those with the,
Oh, yeah.
every child's listed and, when they
So
start.
it shows what
finish,
their
but-
legal address is.
Yeah, and I've seen us say that's not our child too. So, I mean, we do, I know you guys really do pay a lot of attention to that.
We call it.
This slide always brings up a lot of conversation.
So last slide here, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Bitts, as we're going to get ready to talk about staffing. But around enrollment and program, new staff requests are in at about $907,000. Student service contracts, which is a variety of things, including placements. Dr. Bitts, is $567,000 approximately. MASD Online Keola is a program. It's another example, maybe back to when we were talking about the IU. The IU runs the Keola program and districts can participate, and we do. Ms. Kristen Gross is kind of our person in-house on staff, but interfaces with the IU and the Keola program, and so that's an increase of 228,000.
Is that from enrollment going up or from rebalancing the general fund IU budget on our like taking it out through
It's
Kale?
usage based.
Yeah, increase in number of courses, so we did, if you remember, shift our Adjournment onto the Keola platform. So as those classes have gotten larger, and then we do have an increased number of online electives that.
So that's a good piece of context in that Keola can serve as our direct comparison to the cyber charter schools. They can be fully online in Keola, but we also use Keola as platform for other pieces too, to say there might be requirements that we're providing to supplement our programs.
So if I'm hearing that correctly, if we have a course that we offer or in
school students, yes.
online. That's budgeted, that would show at the tail of discussions. Whether it was foreign language, whatever this be, but
We have a list of about 18, I think, right now.
Transportation services, 349,000 approximately. And so this is, I would say, driven by two things. One is just the annual cost of transportation increasing, but also our van services and what's happening around the usage of vans, things of that nature. And then finally, other cost centers, 337,000 is comprised of probably many things, I would say. And so in your budget binders, as you look at that, whether that's tonight or in the weeks to come, you'll see additional detail on all of the increases, but in particular, those other cost centers where we kind of group together, here's the increase there. So that's it's to a $2.3 million on total enrollment. So, and Dr. Pitts is gonna talk about staffing.
Let's talk about our programs. This is the fun part of our program. So you've seen these concentric circles here before, looking at when we think about staffing, trying to think about the different layers, if you will, of our structure. And ultimately, we know that closest to our students, the staff members that are working with our students the most are our teachers, and on the support side, our instructional support. Kind of that next ring out is where we start talking about our administration that provides support to the teachers and to our instructional support staff. And that, again, that's building support and our administrators. And then ultimately, outside of our buildings and departments, we have district office administration and district support. So we've talked about this before in the sense of when you look at a new position and we're talking about adding something, you can kind of picture how many positions would you say are in that closest ring and working your way out. And for many years, as our enrollment has grown, we really had to focus on that black inner ring to be able to add support for our students, teacher with our students in the classroom. And certainly over the last several years, we have also started to add some different positions in those outer rings as well to make sure that the supports for the buildings exist also. This year, I will tell you that you're going to see mostly positions that are closest to our students. And if you think of it in another context of those positions that are absolutely needed because there's going to be a classroom of kids there that need a staff member with them. If you think about staff members who are needs, maybe they could wait another year or two before we would absolutely need to add the position. But there are certainly needs. And then if you think of maybe positions that are truly wants, and something that would certainly expand our program and be something that would help us advance who we are, most of the positions you're going to see are in that first category. Positions that we have classrooms of kids that we need staff members with. And a few would be in that second category where could we hold off another year, perhaps? But boy, there are definitely needs that are present. So in total, the way we do this is through all the 42, 45 cost center budgets. People are able to make requests about positions. For the most part, that's through the principal cost center budgets. But looking at our different positions, we had 24 requests this year. And the positions that we included in the budget are 9 new contracts, and then 3 positions that are actually reallocations of open contracts. That's where you get to the $900,000. There's also a reduction in contracted services, and as we go through the positions, I'll point that out, describe that. So we're going to go through the whole list. Feel free if you have questions as we go through the list to ask as we get to a particular position. But certainly at the end, you can ask some questions as well. So MASH personal finance teacher. So at the high school, based on the course that we approved earlier this year, that personal finance is going to be a required course throughout the state of Pennsylvania. We're choosing to do that as a half-year course in 10th grade and a half-year course in 12th grade. So this would be the teacher that would be adding enough services to be able to accomplish that. French. Sorry. French, this is one that at the high school over the last several years, we've actually been borrowing services across middle school and high school. We have one French teacher at the middle school, one French teacher at the high school. The numbers in French have been increasing a bit. So it started out a few years ago where we had to have one section covered where French teacher would come up. This year, I think it was 2 one semester and 1 this semester. So there were 3 sections that needed to be covered up at the high school. And at this point, there's enough sections that we really just need to add another person to be able to cover all the French at both the middle and the high school.
But why French?
Yeah, it remains one of the traditional big 3, and obviously the seats are doing the talking with it as well. We've got students that are interested in taking it. It continues to be one that is supported as one that certifications are made available here in Pennsylvania for teachers to teach it. And ultimately, as I said, there's interest.
But there's interest because that's what we offer. And you have to take a language and you have to take a language in high school. That's a state law, right? We have to offer
You
this.
don't have to take one.
You don't have to take one. We have to offer.
There's some beliefs, but even this has changed over time as to how many years of a language you should take if you're going off to a university. That continues to be discussed as you really should have 2 or 3, but even the stance on that has softened over the years as to whether it's never truly been a requirement, but that's kind of been the unwritten rule that if you want to go to university, you should have some foreign language experience, but it's not a requirement.
So it's not a requirement, but we offer 3 languages.
Yes,
And so if you want to take a language, it's one of the 3. And I'll stop beating this to death, but it seems like an odd thing to continue to invest in when we could be offering sections of things that are more suited to the international landscape of the 21st century.
Yeah, we've been able to add some additional languages through the Keola electives. There was a Chinese course that for some period of time. I don't know if anybody's in that at the moment. Spanish certainly continues to grow as one of our main offerings of the 3. Yeah, numbers there for French.
Do the kids still have to take all 3 languages in middle school?
So the exploratory program that we used to have that we don't have. There was that year that you would have like 3
third.
weeks of one and 3 weeks of the next to try and get a taste for what you want to answer. And obviously elementary Spanish was something that we used to have as well.
I feel like that's something that even the idea of shifting into an earlier, not this position, obviously this is sort of said and done, but earlier language learning versus, this is all anecdotal, but I don't think anyone's really proficient out of taking languages here or anywhere. I don't know. You can order a beer at Seymour Frogs, maybe, but like this is I don't know. And that's after I took 4 years of German and then more in college. So but it's not I feel like it's I don't know what the goal is of this one, and why we would need to continue to put a lot more into it without expanding it.
I don't think the benefit of the foreign languages, though, is only in being able to speak it fluently. I think that my experience, mostly with my kids, they had experiences in understanding the cultures better and deeper, and also, now that was when Latin was here, but the opportunity, even I guess in German, some of those stems of those kinds of words, depending upon what profession you go into, I think are beneficial also. So I think there are a lot of aspects to language that can be beneficial, not speaking specifically to French, but world languages in general.
It develops that.
Right, yeah, right.
I have a question about personal finance. You said that was something required by the state. Is that something that's actively required this coming year?
Yes, starting next
Is
year.
there funding available for that particular?
Unfunded mandate.
And the legislator doesn't take personal finance classes.
They did. I will say this, that there's a lot of flexibility as to the certification that is required to teach that. So it does not have to be a BCIT or business computer information technology. It could also be social studies, it could be math. So there's some flexibility there, which is nice.
I mean, I think it's good. Funding.
Elementary librarian. So this goes along with the fine and applied arts endorsement that you made the other week, was the first of what would ultimately be 3 additions over these next few years, would be to phase these in, and elementary librarian addition of that in the first step of that process. MASH social studies teacher. So when you look at numbers at the high school, definitely our social studies courses are packed. It's also a department that has quite a few electives. When you think about things like sociology, psychology, and certainly some EP courses and other electives that we have in social studies, we have quite a few, and those are all pretty high numbers right now. So we really need to have some relief there by adding a position. In this case, we have a contract that has been in the budget for several years that originally was approved as a new tech ed teacher. For a variety of reasons, that wasn't a position that we ultimately were looking to fill yet. That's not to say we won't be back in future years looking for another tech ed teacher, but we weren't looking to fill that yet. And obviously, with wanting to use our contracts as wisely as we could, we're looking to reallocate that for the social studies teacher. So it would be budget neutral, but it is a new position, so to make sure you do consider. Similarly, with the K-3 literacy coach, we have carried an extra elementary contract the last several years, and similarly, we haven't needed to use that one. And based on numbers, we should need that next year as well. So we would look to reallocate that for a second K-3 literacy coach. Obviously, with hopeful progression towards changing our literacy program at the primary level, coming in the next few meetings to be able to do our final report out on how that pilot has been going. Ultimately, we need support, because the program is only going to be as effective as our ability to support it, not just with the company and with the folks that have already been engaged in it, but making sure we have coaches available to come alongside teachers and help them with their efforts to implement the program will be really important. So a second literacy coach would enable us to have one focused on 2 of the grade levels, likely focusing their efforts on K and 1 with teachers, and then a second literacy coach that really becomes an expert in grades 2 and 3 and provides support to the teachers.
What are the other levels supported by literacy coaches?
So right now we still have then at the elementary level 2 other instructional coaches who, while their primary focus is new teachers, they're certainly providing support outside of that as well. And then we have an instructional coach at the middle school, an instructional coach at the high school.
So those coaches don't focus on a particular topic area anymore. There's no
Correct.
math instructional, there's no tech
Correct.
technology.
Yes. All just instructional coaches. And then we have at the secondary level, the reading intervention department coordinator as well, provides more specific support to the reading specialists. Instructional support in that area, an additional ELD teacher at the high school. So earlier this year, we had a sudden need at the high school based on a number of move-ins that we had to fill a temporary position there, a teacher on assignment for the rest of this year. And we anticipated the likelihood that we would probably be coming back with a full-time position, being our request here, and certainly that does continue to be the need. So this would really be a position that has already kind of been LTS of sorts here for the second half of the year, but this would make it permanent as part of the staff.
I'll go back just to one thing. I know that you mentioned that we often carry an extra elementary teacher in the budget. Are we going to carry an extra elementary teacher in the budget in addition to all of this?
So we will still have margin to meet any surprise demands.
Got it.
KA Special Ed IA, so we have continued needs at the Kindergarten Academy of students coming into us, some with known needs, and others with unknown needs when they come to us. And ultimately having an additional Special Ed IA to provide support down there, we'll have another set of hands to be able to provide support. So that's really nice.
I now need to go back one. Why is the ELD teacher not in instruction? Why-
Oh, really just the classification of it because it's in student services. We place it there in instructional support as opposed to instruction. We see the instructional part as more of the core area of support, and then student services, we just typically list under instructional support.
Because it's a smaller classroom.
Yeah, just because it's with student services.
Okay.
Mr. Bingham section there in the second section. North side instructional assistant. So this one is something we've added an additional instructional assistant to each of the primary buildings over the last several years. And north side, we have not yet. So this is just continuing in that pattern and adding an additional set of hands that could be with special education. It could be with reading aid. It could be in any number of areas, but it would be an instructional assistant to provide different supports. Speech and language pathologist, this is the one that was the reduction in contracted services. So several years ago, we started contracting a portion of a caseload for speech and language services. And at one point, it was about a third of the caseload, and then it was closer to 2/3 or 3/4 of the caseload. And we're to the point where we really, it just benefits us to hire someone completely on our salary schedule. So instead of continuing the contract, so there's a reduction in contracted services also in the budget, but this would be a new position to us.
So we won't have outside service anymore.
Correct. At this,
So probably an even, is it supposed to be like an even?
it generally is. Yeah. It's generally. Kindergarten, personal care assistants, these are frequently reallocations. This is a case where we have PCA that's no longer going to be needed at the high school, but we will have the need for one at the kindergarten academy. So that's just the shifting of a contract. Elementary social worker. So right now we have one social worker in one building for 4 grades, one in one building for 3 grades, and one in 6 buildings for 6 grades. So really looking to be able to spread that wealth at the elementary level. Certainly our initial conversations was, do we have one person that's servicing the 4 primary buildings and one that's servicing the 2 academies? That's not written in stone yet, but something like that kind of breakdown to be able to provide additional support. And then custodian. Yeah, Mr. Hoffman and his crew continues to do more with the same amount. We have not increased the number of custodians nearly by the same amount that we've increased in square footage across the buildings. But we definitely need to continue to chip away at providing additional support to keep our buildings as nice as they do right now. So an additional custodian to continue to add to their. So that's all the staffing additions. If you have any other general questions about any of this. So the summary, ultimately, we got to hear about the revenue several weeks ago. We heard about the expenses here tonight, and ultimately keeping track. That looks at a projected revenue of 104 million and projected expenses of 109 million. So that puts us at a preliminary deficit of just under $5 million. And ultimately, recommendation that we would move forward with is a 4.5% tax increase that is encompassing 1% for construction and 3.5% for operations, which would get our operating budget deficit down to $2.5 million. Ultimately, I would say that for the first budget that I bring forward to you, would I love for that tax increase to be less than 4.5? Bet. Would I love for that deficit to be less than 2.5? You bet. But I also am very confident in the work that's been done by our teams to be able to look at this as thoughtfully as they have. And I believe this is the situation that we're in this year with the needs that we have across expenses and to continue to provide the support we need for our programs. So there's a few more slides here that we'll go through, just making some comparisons, and I'll pass that off to Mr. Cornwell.
If I have a question on your last, I forget the exact title, but what's the cap what we could have for a tax?
5%.
5%.
And we'll come back to that slide.
Okay, great.
This is a kind of a similar slide to what we looked at earlier, but I took that up. It's just another way to look at, when you look at the total tax increase year over year, what's the context around the percentage that we've been setting aside for construction and the financing plan? And then the other part of that is, what have we been increasing to support operations? And so this is a little bit unique for a growing school district. I would suggest that there's a number of districts when their total tax increases is read in the paper or talked about in a presentation, their total tax increase really is operational. And our total tax increase for a number of years now has been both financing plan, construction, and operational. And then the last column there that's shaded, you can see the maximum allowable percentage tax increase there. The other thing here we wanted to talk a little bit about, and we've talked about before over the years, is just relatively where are we in the county? And so you can see our millage rate there compared to our peers, our neighbors. I think, again, you know, all of these slides or all these data points, sometimes the additional context is helpful. And I think in some ways the millage alone doesn't necessarily tell the entire picture, the entire story, because I think that intersects with the whole idea of fair funding in the state, right? And so at a local level, what's your ability to raise revenue? What's happening locally with enrollment? And then how's that balanced at a state level in terms of trying to establish equity across the school districts? And that's where that fair funding lawsuit came into play. I think one way to look at that even is you look at assessed values. So there's probably two things being charted out here that I would point out. The first is the bar graphs of assessed values for the school districts. Again, those peers we just looked at on the last slide. And then you can see the gray is the real estate tax rate, the millage rate being charted across or overlaid across those assessed values. And so I think in an ideal world, you would want a formula from the state that is responsive to what degree or what capacity has the local community been able to fund their schools, and looking for that equity of funding of schools. Then the state is taking all of that into consideration. They're looking at things like enrollment growth or enrollment decline. And I think that's where we kind of have a little bit of an imperfect system, frankly, because the state funding, as we've talked about over the years, has a large percentage that's still harmless from decades of you get what you get plus a couple percent. Then there's the Basic Education Funding Commission. We talked about that earlier in the month. That was a commission that studied and developed another formula in 2016 to flow some monies through to support local school districts. And then most recently, there's the adequacy funding line item. And so all of that's aimed at, the adequacy funding line item in particular is aimed at trying to re-equalize or level that fair funding conversation. But I think it's still an issue, frankly. Even though some good steps were taken, I still think there's a reality that there needs to be a formula that's more responsive to things like a district maybe like us, where we've grown 20% in the last 10 years. And to make a connection back to the concentric circles that Dr. Vince pointed out, you know, when you think about that first band of what are we doing to support students in our buildings and classrooms, well, when you've grown by 20% and you want your class size at a certain level, then that causes you to scale up the system in terms of staffing. And so all of that is connected ultimately to the expense of the school and the cost to operate it and how it's funded between local, state, and federal.
A short number, that's only the Cumberland County residents, or is that both?
Yeah, that one, I want to take a closer look at that. That could very well be, because West Shore has two high schools and these small counties, and so it's hard to compare across counties. So that one's a little bit of an outlier perhaps, but because then you get into counties when they've last reassessed. So there's some counties that have reassessed for 60 years, some counties that have done it as recently as a year ago.
Well, and Greg, I think if you go back 2 slides to this chart, it's not to say, any of these are better than others. I mean that just because we might be on the higher end of the group, but not the highest, not second highest. But third out of what, 9? I mean, but it doesn't mean that. Does it mean that Cumberland Valley is running a much more efficient district than us? No. Does it mean that? What I think it means is that there's, it's the last 60 years of decisions on millage to take them to this point. And so you overlay whatever things look like for different periods of time where there was no growth, or there was where the PSERS contribution rate was 7% and not 33%, and where all sorts of other decisions kind of went into this. It isn't like we all set it once a year and decide, like, are we going to be higher or lower than Big Spring? We aren't closest. It's just such an artifact of like everything that's come to this point. So I think you and I talked about this slide, and I think it's even better to show more than what we had shown in the past, but still like not, you get nothing out of it, other than if you're moving houses where you pay the least amount of taxes next year.
And to your point, because of the Act 1 index, you're not going to see dramatic changes in the district.
Yeah, right.
There's not, because obviously there's only so much that the districts on the bottom are going to be able to increase in a particular year. So just never going to see much of a change.
Yeah.
Can we go back one more slide?
Oh, one more. Sorry, wrong direction. There we go.
I'm really concerned about the 4.5 being the highest in the last 8 ever, probably. I don't know if we've ever been up that high, but and I know sometimes you budget a little bit conservatively, and then we end up getting more money, like $500,000 or something more than we expected or something. But like, if the board would say, we're not going to go 4.5, do you have a plan B as to what can be cut out of the budget to bring that number down a little bit, or?
It would impact student. There's no fat to be trimmed that wouldn't impact student. When you look at the areas that are those biggest trends and expenses, it's areas that we have to catch up with healthcare, just have to. And ultimately, you could make the case that maybe we waited a year too long to try and catch up with healthcare, and that 3.9 should have even been higher than what it was last year. But the reality is that after 2 years in a row, we have to catch up there. The revenue, will we ultimately see more revenue from the state? Maybe, and we've already accounted for what we think is a safe number there, of being about halfway through the adequacy that we talked about last time. Certainly, if they do pass a flat rate for cyber charter, that would be a huge difference. That would improve that $2.5 billion deficit, because that's the other thing is, even at 4.5, we're stretching that operating deficit to 2.5, which is a little higher than it is higher than what we've ever had before as a budgeted deficit, but we still feel comfortable. But the reality is that this year, in all likelihood, we will probably run an actual deficit for the first time in quite some time. Decades.
I think more than Mike's lifetime.
I
Well, my point is, so we have to explain to the public that we're raising their taxes 4.5 because of healthcare. Is that?
And I think there's part of the story there, but I think part of the story, frankly, for me, is also the fair funding conversation and the charter school conversation. I think if you go back and look at the charter school slide, and you see how sharply that line increased in the last 3 or 4 years, that's definitely part of the story. And I think the fair funding part is also equally part of the story. You know, when you consider that we've added almost 1,000 kids in the last, I'll say, 8 to 10 years. Maybe.
It takes us back to being 450th out of 500 in terms of state revenue. So that slide that we looked at last time on the revenue side, 19th out of 23 within our IU. The reality is that you're being put in a position where in order to fund our school district, it's got to be on the backs of our local taxpayers because we're not getting more from the state currently.
I mean, this, you know, you probably can't dictate what the township does, but the township is aware that tax rates are going up because of all the development that's happening.
But they'll tell you that that's not their concern. Their concern is to bring people into the district, into the township, and that if they bring people into the township because people want to live here and businesses and everything else, they say school is secondary, that it's not their primary concern. You know, they're not going to control because they don't want the schools to be, they could, but they will not control.
We get blamed for
Because
increasing the taxes.
Right, so
So would it be more fair to say, I'm sorry, John, would it be more fair to say that we have that a tax increase, because we are gonna have enrollment increase next year, is sort of the top line thing, right? And then, and medical costs, I'm trying to work this out in my head too, Tracy, but this is it's a real thing, and I think you point out this slide from 2 weeks ago, 457th is bad. 19th out of 23 makes the argument to me that it's not like the state is sending money to Philadelphia, right? The state isn't even funding us well within our IU locally. 19th out of 23 is not where you want to be when we are the, I don't know, third or fourth biggest out of 23 in the IU. So I think there's that the fair funding is a real problem, and you can't, every new kid, whether thinking about it from the cyber charter slide, 15 grand for a non-special ed student. I know there are taxpayers who pay 15 grand, but not many. Like, it's not like, well, every new house, you know, their tax dollars go to, no, like, you know, 20% of their tax dollars, and then, you know, four or five families it takes to send each kid to a cyber charter. So it's not a, we can't, it doesn't keep up, you know.
The other part too is, honestly, and maybe it's not fair to tie it to this whole idea of fair funding, but even the financing of planning construction increase, I think you can argue that they put the moratorium in place on FanCon funding, and so that's not just a Mechanicsburg issue. Frankly, it's all the 500 school districts are wrestling with how do you fund school construction, but that moratorium's been on effect for a long time. We were very fortunate administratively when we were able to slip some of the elementary schools in that little gap. But outside of that, I want to say the moratorium, I mean, I started at Newport in 2010 and as a business manager, and I think the moratorium came into effect probably within 4 or 5 years of that, and it's been in effect since then, except for that tiny little window.
And the high school didn't get it. The high school project did not.
Yeah, and that's a good point. So that's maybe another part of it too, is the high school project didn't get funded through FanCon. That was 100% local, which again, it's back to enrollment, you know, and program and infrastructure. And so when you look at that operational tax increase, that's another piece of context, I think, when we start to unpack the reasons around where we are. I think the other thing in developing a budget proposal I would share is we've had through all the different cost center conversations and even at the cabinet level, we've looked at all the different dials to come to this final kind of proposal. And I think to Dr. Vince's point, I would just echo, it would be challenging to go back and try to turn those dials even harder, because part of what we're also trying to manage is the multiple years of budgeting. And so one thing that I would suggest is within our budget methodology, we like to look at our fund balance. What story is our fund balance telling us? Because if our fund balance is pretty stable year over year, I think it tells us that, hey, the budgeting process is good, I would suggest. Not that. But if generally the fund balance is pretty stable, that's what you want. And then when you benchmark where we are with our fund balance against the IU, we're about 21%. It's in tab 5 there. If you look, you can see where our fund balance history is. So at 21%, we're right in the midst of the average of the IU school districts in terms of total fund balance. And then when you look at the progression of our fund balance, it's also steady, which is an indicator that year over year in our budget process, we're not adding a ton of fund balance unknowingly. We're also not using a ton of fund balance unknowingly. Both of which might be indicators that we're either too conservative in the budget or that we're not aggressive enough in the budget. And so I think that to me is another maybe big picture signal to say fund balance is an indicator of what's happening cumulatively. And when you look at that, that kind of historical look back, I will note that purposefully the district had set money aside, and you can see some transfer of the capital reserve fund. That was through the pension increases and knowing some construction. And so our fund balance probably was a little higher at one point years and years ago, which ultimately helped us, frankly, from a board perspective and the decision to them to have cash to help address some of these facility projects as we went through the financing plans. But ultimately coming together with a package then, as Dr. Pitts said, to say, with the tax increase, adjusting the deficit a little bit higher, but also trying to manage our fund balance to say, we don't want to be so risky in that we start having cumulative deficits here. So medical is a part of it, and it's influencing 24, 25, and in 25, 26.
So the point, how much money is 0.5?
0.5%, probably 200, and I'll say $260,000 probably, give or take.
I just wanted to point out, because there's some newer board members, really quickly, the Act 1 index, what are the biggest driving factors?
So statewide wages is a factor. It's a formula, but the idea with Act 1 index was to tie it to an index at a state level to see what's happening in the labor market and the wages, and then trying to create a cap, if you will, for what school districts can do around a tax increase. You can see it was pretty low way back in 1819. And I would suggest if you go back probably even the year before that, it was probably in the 2s and 3s, mostly.
No, it wasn't. And that was my point is, if you look at the first 4 years when we had low inflation, you had much lower. Employees weren't getting as big a raises as that. We actually raised our tax to the limit, essentially 100% what we could. And with your post-COVID inflation, which has really been a driving force over the last 4 or 5 years, we haven't reached that limit each time. So even though the number might be much higher than I like to come out of my mouth, we're not reaching the index limit each year, which I think is actually very commendable when you look at what the inflation rate's been, particularly in labor markets, medical and things like that. That has been the driving force in raising that. So I think you have to look at the whole thing.
The index is twice as much as it was.
But that's because of actual costs, that are real. It's not some imaginary thing. Our expenses have gone up that much, and we're not even reaching that limit, which we did in those 4 years and many years prior to that. We had a much lower inflation.
Are we using any fund balance for this budget?
So as Dr. Pitts alluded to earlier, we carry a budget deficit in the budget, and our budget deficit is around $2.5 million for 25, 26 is what we propose. So last year we had proposed, well, we adopted, I should say not proposed, proposed and adopted. It was 2.35, I think, was where we were. And that number is kind of inched its way up. And I think we want to just be careful that the more you inch it higher, the more likely it is that you have a deficit. And so we try to manage that. I would say manage it in a way where it's our operating risk. And so in any given year, if we're willing to use this much out of our fund balance, that's what happens in a worst case year. Our goal is always to break even, frankly, because like I said, we don't want to just have $20 million surpluses every year, because that would suggest there's something wrong with the budget process. But if fund balance is otherwise pretty steady and you're not seeing big sharp increases or decreases, then I think it's a sign that maybe the annual budget process we haven't kind of dialed in, and that's I think a good indicator. But ultimately, this is up to your point. Yes, we do carry a budget deficit that is a little bit higher, frankly, than I'd love it to be a little bit lower, as Dr. Vince said. But I think all things considered, 2%. It's 2% on the total budget. So, yeah.
And we're assuming that if we had adopted this budget, we would use $2.5 million. It's in your slide. We would use $2.5 million of fund balance to rectify the deficit.
In worst case,
But Yeah, but it's literally what you're proposing. It's not within a range like we do. And some of that is the unknown budget of, like, it would be great if they did charter reform, but we're gonna pass our budget before they do it. Correct. So we don't, that would be a truly best case scenario, but even just what you're really talking about best and worst case is what the BEF and the adequacy are gonna be. Like, we don't believe there'll be any charter reform in our budget based on the 25 years of no charter reform. So
Did not account for that.
Yeah.
Correct.
Well, the medical claims that can go down. Have we considered changing the, what's it called, the stop insurance? As far as-
Stop loss, yeah, we look at that, and it's a classic question of like, how much risk are you willing to take from an insurance perspective versus your own cash reserves? Because ultimately that'll be reflected in the premium. And so we do look at that annually with Conrad Siegel, and we benchmark that too against other school districts to say, well, what attachment point do schools our size generally have? We look at what we pay in premium balance against what that looks like over a cumulative years. And so a number of different things we look at there, but I think sometimes it comes down to actuarially, I think health insurance, they would say you're bound to have kind of a bad year, 1 or 2 years out of a 7 or 9 year period of time, right? You know, and so we look at health insurance, we were kind of on a good trajectory there for a number of years and probably years. And it just so happens that we had a few years of back-to-back years, and now we've got to reset the budget to get it right.
So if we were to, if you go back to the
I think it's the last slide. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm not going.
Either way, I think it's at the end and it's earlier.
this slide.
Okay, sorry.
So if we were to if we were to do a 4% tax increase, the deficit would be, in round numbers, $3.1 million instead of $2.5 million. That what you were saying based on this conversation.
No, I'm sorry, Sue, if you said that.
About 3.1 million if we were to change the real estate increase to about 4% instead of 4.5 for the overall tax increase.
So the 0.5% would be about 260,000.
Oh, it'd be 260. Okay. Oh, sorry, I thought it was 5. I'm with you. Okay, so
1% is 500%. Correct?
okay, thank you. That's easy.
It doesn't shift that.
Like last year, in the last couple of years when we were doing this, so we were around 2-3 as our, and we kind of came in some years a little bit ahead, and some years we took out a fund balance. So even this number is a bigger operational risk than we have in prior budgets. And so if we were to change the real estate tax increase, we would be adding more to risk than we had, but then we've already ratcheted up the risk now.
The risk is you make the deficit potentially more real because we've got that much more ground to cover just to get back to break even, which is always our goal. And the reason we're comfortable with some level of operating deficit or operating risk is, you know, like what happened in 3 years, 2024, 25. We adopted our budget way in front of what the state did. And as their process drug on, we ended up getting some extra money, which frankly actually helped 24, 25, even though it's likely a deficit, it would have been a worse deficit yet had we not. And so we do budget state revenue increases as an example, but we also try to be fair in what's realistic that we can expect from the state. And if something more comes in, then it helps us with that bottom line number.
And ultimately, the getting to the 2.5 did involve quite a few conversations, including prioritizing that list of 24 requests to 12. And really 9 that are budgetary increases. So that there was a significant number of conversations there about what positions are truly needs with this particular budget year. I feel like we've gotten to that point.
I'm glad Dr. Fitz pointed that out because I think even as we came from a proposal perspective and kind of put it all together and say, where are we in terms of total bottom line? We did talk about staffing, and we also talked about our replacement cycles, and we we had many conversations to say, what adjustments can we do to get to a number that we're ultimately comfortable with, that maybe is a compromise. So we did adjust a variety of things in the budget just to get it to the place where we would then say, where might a tax increase land, and then where might we be with an operating deficit proposal for the school. So.
I think we skipped some slides.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I think.
Because
Not too many.
so.
So, you know, kind of like, what we talked a little about with fund balance, like what are indicators in a 50,000 foot view to say what's happening with the budget? How are we situated? What's the cost to operate the school district? And so one thing that we look at, as a district is to say, in terms of revenue per student or ADM, where do we stand against the IU and where do we stand against the state average? But also state expense per ADM, where do we stand against the IU? Where do we stand against the state? And you can see that we're below the state average for revenue per student. We're below our IU average for revenue per student. And this is total revenue per student, by the way. And then in terms of expense, we're below the state average for expense per student. We're below the IU average for expense per student. And I think in some ways, a good thing that we provide high quality education. I feel we have high quality programs. And when you kind of look at benchmarking in terms of what we get in terms of total revenue and total spend, you can kind of see how we stack up against our peers. So. We do often talk with the board when we talk about the tax increase. You know, we talk about percentages, we talk about millage, but what's the practical? What does it really mean? You know, for our taxpayers. And so when you look at the median assessed value of 192,400, you can see across the municipalities that looks a little different depending on which municipality you live in. But ultimately, if your house is valued at 192,400, the average annual tax bill before and after the tax increase, you can see that the average annual tax increase is $141 based on that 192,400. We talked a little bit about this slide already, getting to that preliminary budget deficit of 4.9 million. Sorry, Ms.
Well, I'm gonna request publicly that if you could give us copies of these slides from last meeting and this meeting.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I think there's a lot of information in there that's really not in the binders.
Yep.
And I just spend the whole time writing everything, but the median house, value being 192,000, how much more was that? 41 or 42? 140.
Or $12.
Thank you.
It's the revenue one. I didn't look. It's on board docs from the last meeting.
Yeah, Mr. Sanker had a good call. We do put the presentations on Word docs, and we also put the presentation on the website. So if there's something more important, like we can certainly print our copies or something small.
Where are they on board docs?
We usually attach them after the meeting, so it should be.
In the superintendent's report in the last meeting. That's where that.
The proposed operating deficit, tax increase then leads us to kind of next steps with where we're at with the school board. So tonight being the second of two presentations, having provided the board the budget binders, and then considering the first of two approvals potentially at April 8th, and then the final approval would be June 10th to get everything in place for the coming school.
Thank you, gentlemen. Move on to item 5, facilities. Item 5.01, Mechanicsburg Middle School masonry repair. Mr. Hoffman.
I thought I was here to present the budget. Thanks.
Careful what you wish for.
Yeah. Actually, well, we'll take you up on that next year.
Help us next time.
You're getting an extra custodian, so you got some time in your hands.
Right. Now, we're happy to propose these two projects. A lot of time and effort has been put into getting this to a place where we can bring it to you, specifically the playground project. But in regards, to the masonry project, We had an extensive inspection performed back in late spring, early summer, and I've adjusted that proposal as the months have gone on to be able to bring it to you. As you can see here, a lot of caulking and expansion joints, three-pointing mortar joints. A lot of work needs done on these masonry areas of the building, as well as around windows, doors, louvers. All kind of seems like it's going at the same time, which isn't really uncommon with buildings. So we feel it's a necessary project to take on, and we feel the same. Questions?
It's always more expensive not to maintain it. You know, sure. But to your point, water tank buildings. That's right.
And some chunks that don't need to be completed because of the construction as well.
Yeah.
I was just gonna ask that. So like, because of the stairwell construction, that actually made the area smaller, I guess.
It did, because we had gotten a few updated proposals throughout the year, and that price was increasing, as things do every 90 days. And then after we got the project approved for the middle school, it actually dropped it back down a little bit based on the area.
And then we're looking for putting this forward.
Yes.
Move on to item 5.02, replacement playground equipment, Shermanstown.
Really excited about this one. I think it's a beautiful play set to be built for kids. You can see the renderings on the board docs, so we're excited. Get that done this summer.
I know this has been a pet project of yours for many years,
I've been on the board for 23 years because we didn't have grass there, so
but you're still not.
Got mold.
still not getting any grass.
Grass on either side.
Yeah, the rendering of the playground, it's not accurate outside of the playground there. That's just for looks.
Green.
Yeah.
Tracy's getting excited.
There's not a lot
I-
of
The
land
the
around there.
playground will be in the same area where it currently is.
Yes, the actual area of the containment is a bit smaller. We're chopping off the edge that's kind of on an angle, it's built on an angle. Right now, the containment is built up, and we've been getting away from that, so it's gonna be subsurface and surrounded by the asphalt that's there.
Questions of playground equipment?
Just happy that it's happening and that we are continuing our efforts in equity across all buildings that we have students. So that's good. My question, Mr. Officer, what you alluded to other work at Shermanstown building. Can you give us an update on some of the other things that you are working on?
Yes, past year, we've replaced a number of exterior doors, floor tile replacement. We redid the staff restroom and was the kindergarten restroom, new floor, new fixtures. We've been slowly replacing dispensers, electrical outlets, things of that nature. We redid the kitchens last summer. We are working on replacing some windows, trying to spend more time down there from a maintenance standpoint, to just keep on things. So we're in a pretty good place. We're getting there. Made strides the last couple of years.
Great, that's more than I had known about, that, you know, and I think Mr. Longwell was selling you short what the plan was there. He says, there was a coat of paint and you guys were out of there, so.
It's a pain.
Yeah.
Mr. Hoffman's our resident expert, so I probably look some things up. Sorry. Are there some accessibility, like, concerns? Are there some features in here for students with accessibility needs? Or is that something that's needed in that facility too?
I think it's the same accessibility features that we have that the rest of our schools. That's another reason for the containment to be down. It's that fiber wood carpeting, which is easier to access. So, yeah.
Questions from Mr. Hoffman? Seeing that, we'll move that forward then for the April vote. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nothing else on the agenda. Meeting is adjourned.